How a bomber pilot's desperate act of physics rewrote the rules of aerial combat. August 1943, Solomon Islands. A B-25 Mitchell bomber was already dead. At least that was the unspoken verdict in the minds of its 6 crewmen and the 8 Japanese Zero fighters circling above. The American aircraft, lagging behind its formation, was a picture of mortal distress. Thick, oily smoke streamed from its port engine, a grim banner against the vast Pacific sky. Inside the shuddering fuselage, the atmosphere was a suffocating cocktail of fear, resignation, and sweat-stained leather. The starboard engine, straining to compensate, began its own death rattle, a series of metallic coughs, followed by the ominous creep of its temperature gauge into the red. They had 3 minutes, perhaps 5, before total power failure. Below, the ocean stretched, infinite and pitiless. There were no rescue ships within 50 miles. Capture meant a prison camp, or worse. The Zeros, sleek and predatory, held the altitude advantage. They were patient. They had fuel, they had speed, and they had the ruthless calculus of aerial warfare on their side. A crippled bomber is a killed bomber. Captain Eric Dawson, the pilot, observed this closing trap with an unsettling calm. Through his spider-webbed canopy, he tracked the enemy fighters as they began to sort into attack positions. His pro-pilot's voice, tight with controlled panic, called out their steady descent. 200 feet per minute, Skipper. Behind him, the navigator abandoned his charts for a grim new task, plotting the most likely ditching coordinates, a pointless pinpoint in a trackless blue desert. In the waist and tail, gunners spun their turrets, their hands slick on the triggers, calling out ammunition counts that sounded like epitaphs. Every man was performing the rituals of impending doom. Then, Eric Dawson committed an act of professional sacrilege. He reached forward, not to adjust the failing engine, but to murder it. His hand moved with deliberate, almost clerical precision to the mixture control of the starboard engine, the one still producing power, and pulled it to idle cutoff. The roar that had been their world for hours choked into a splutter, then silence. The propeller windmilled for a few phantom revolutions before Dawson feathered it, dragging the blades parallel to the wind to kill their drag. The sudden quiet was deafening, broken only by the rush of air over stressed aluminum. The bomber's nose pitched down. They were no longer flying, they were falling in a controlled, silent glide. The aircraft had become a 19,000-pound deadweight. In the cockpit, chaos erupted. The co-pilot lunged for the controls, his voice a raw shout in the intercom. "What in God's name are you doing?" The navigator demanded answers. From the tail, the gunner yelled that the Zeros were peeling off, beginning their death dive, sensing the finality of the kill. Dawson did not shout back. His left arm blocked the co-pilot's grasp, his posture rigid. "Hold your fire," he commanded, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Trust me, and hold your fire until I say." He was not looking at his terrified crew. His eyes were locked on the diving Zeros, his mind racing through a silent internal calculus of velocity, descent rates, and closure angles. He was waiting. He was counting. He was betting 6 lives and a $200,000 aircraft on a heretical theory born not in a command briefing, but in a notebook filled with equations. A theory that suggested the only way to survive the unsurvivable was to embrace the appearance of total defeat. He was waiting for physics to intervene where 500 caliber bullets could not. Part 1. The Graveyard of Certainties. To understand the sheer insanity of Dawson's act, one must first understand the bleak arithmetic of the Southwest Pacific Air War in 1943. This was not the storied giant formation war over Europe. This was a war of vast, empty distances, of navigational luck, and of brutal, intimate duels over coral seas. American bomber crews, flying B-25 Mitchells, B-26 Marauders, and A-200 Havocs, faced a nearly insurmountable tactical problem embodied by the Mitsubishi A-6M Zero. The Zero was a revelation in lightweight aerodynamic aggression. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and accelerate quicker than any American fighter in the theater at the time. It was, as one pilot grimly joked, made out of rice paper and hate. But its paper-thin skin and lack of armor belied its lethal agility. The standard U.S. defensive doctrine for bomber crews was straightforward, logical, and increasingly fatal. Maintain speed at all costs. Turn into attacks. Use altitude as a bank of energy. Never, ever become slow and vulnerable. The manuals were unequivocal. Speed equals survival. A bomber caught at low airspeed was a sitting duck. Training films, gunnery instructors, and squadron commanders all pounded this dogma into every airman's head. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. A Zero diving from 20,000 feet converted potential energy into devastating kinetic energy, hitting closure speeds of over 400 miles per hour. A gunner had maybe 5 seconds to track, aim, and fire. The bomber's only hope was to present a harder target by turning and to keep its speed up to retain some shred of maneuverability. But Dawson, the engineer, saw the flaw in the formula. The doctrine assumed the bomber had speed to give. It assumed the bomber's engines were healthy. It assumed the Zero would make a predictable single pass. In the chaotic reality of combat, these assumptions evaporated like mist over the Coral Sea. Bombers took flak damage. Engines pushed beyond endurance in the tropical heat failed. Zeros attacked in packs, from sunward, from below, in coordinated slashing runs that left no room for textbook responses. The result was a spreadsheet of slaughter. 5th Air Force intelligence officers tracked losses that grew with grim regularity. Loss rates of 20 to 30% per mission were not uncommon. For every 10 bombers that crossed the Japanese coastline, statistics coldly predicted 2 would not return. Of the 8 that did, half often carried dead or wounded. The aircraft themselves returned as flying testaments to carnage. Wings pierced by cannon shells, plexiglass turrets smeared with blood, control cables severed and hastily spliced. Ground crews worked through sweltering nights under mosquito nets, patching aluminum and scrubbing the interiors. The problem was not a lack of courage. The crews had that in abundance. The problem was a fundamental asymmetry in energy management, a physics problem that courage alone could not solve. Part 2. The Professor. Eric Dawson didn't fit the mold of a swashbuckling combat pilot. Tall, lean, with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly fogged in the humid air, he looked more like a schoolteacher than a warrior. Before the war, he had been a middling mechanical engineering student at the University of Washington, more comfortable with slide rules and textbooks than with people. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by duty, not passion. The Army Air Forces, seeing his technical background, made him a pilot. In flight school, he was competent but unspectacular, noted for excessive caution. While his peers flew by instinct and feel, Dawson flew by calculation. His instructors wrote reports questioning his aggressive spirit. He graduated in the middle of his class and was shipped to the Pacific, assigned to a B-25 squadron in New Guinea. To his squadron mates, he was an oddity, the professor or the librarian. He didn't drink heavily, didn't boast, didn't chase nurses. While others played cards or wrote letters, Dawson sat in his stifling tent, filling black-bound notebooks. He wasn't writing home, he was deconstructing the war. He sketched attack patterns from memory, calculated fuel consumption curves, compared the turning radii of a B-25 to that of a Zero using captured performance data. He pored over after-action reports, not for the heroisms, but for the data points. At what altitude was the attack initiated? What was the bomber's indicated airspeed at time of hit? Did the bomber turn, and if so, which way?
He began to notice anomalies.
Buried in the dry prose of loss reports were a few rare instances where bombers that had suffered catastrophic, total power loss had somehow survived their subsequent encounter with fighters. These weren't victories, they were crashes or ditchings, but the crews were alive. The official explanation was luck or enemy error. Dawson saw a pattern. In each case, the mortally wounded bomber had entered a steep, powerless descent. The attacking Zeros, following them down, had seemingly struggled to line up a killing shot. Some overshot, others broke off attacks as the bomber neared the water. A theory, audacious and terrifying, began to crystallize in his notes. The Zero was optimized for speed and agility at fighting energies. Its controls were beautifully responsive at 300 knots, but what about at 170? A bomber in a powered glide had a predictable, relatively slow airspeed and a steep descent rate. A Zero pilot diving at 400 knots to intercept would face a massive disparity in closure rates. To avoid overshooting, he would have to violently decelerate, bleeding off his precious energy advantage, or pull up early. A Zero at low speed was a clumsy, wallowing machine, its lightweight construction making it unstable. Dawson scribbled equations in the margin. Potential energy 0 versus controlled descent bomber. Could the energy advantage be turned into a trap? He called it, clinically, energy state manipulation as a defensive tactic. In simpler terms, deliberately become the wounded bird to confuse the hawk. In the humid heat of a squadron commander's tent in late July 1943, Dawson presented his findings. Major Kendrick, a veteran of countless missions with tired eyes, listened in silence as the young captain laid out his diagrams and calculations. Dawson spoke of vectors, drag coefficients, and stall speeds. He referenced the anomalous survival reports. He proposed a controlled test, a volunteer crew to practice the maneuver in a safe zone. When Dawson finished, the silence was thick. Kendrick slowly set down his tin coffee cup. "Captain," he said, his voice low and final, "what you were describing is not the tactic. It's a recipe for a court-martial or a mass funeral." Kendrick's rejection was not based on the physics, which he barely understood. It was based on the psychology of command. "My job is to get these men to climb into these machines every day. They do it because they believe in the procedures, in the training, in the man next to them. If I tell them that our new best hope is to shut off our own engines in the middle of a fight, they will stop flying. They'll find a reason to be sick. They'll lose all faith." He pointed a finger at Dawson's notebooks. "You're asking me to trade the certainty of doctrine, even flawed doctrine, for a theory. If your timing is off by 3 seconds, an entire crew dies to prove you're a fool. I can't authorize that. The discussion is over. Fly the missions as briefed. Keep these ideas to yourself." Dawson left, defeated. The military machine rewarded compliance, not innovation. His theory was relegated to the status of a curious footnote in his private war. But he didn't stop thinking. Every mission reinforced the failure of the standard playbook. He watched friends die following the rules perfectly. The loss rates were relentless, damning proof. He carried the secret with him, a heavy burden. He couldn't tell his crew. How do you tell men who trust you with their lives that you have a plan to save them, but it requires doing the one thing every fiber of their training screams is suicide? The catalyst came on August 7th. The target was the Japanese fortress of Rabaul. Dawson's B-25, Lucky Lass, was part of a follow-on wave. The mission went according to the bloody script. Flak over the harbor, the shudder of bomb release, then the dreaded call, "Bandits, high and 10 o'clock." 8 Zeros found them. As Dawson turned for home, the port engine, strained from takeoff and combat power settings, failed catastrophically, a seized bearing, unrelated to enemy fire. He feathered it. Lucky Lass became a one-engine cripple, losing altitude and speed, drifting out of the protective formation.
The Zeros saw it immediately. Like wolves separating a limping caribou from the herd, 4 of them broke off and circled. Dawson's crew performed their drills with grim proficiency. The co-pilot suggested jettisoning everything to lighten the load. The navigator frantically searched for a friendly island within gliding distance. The gunners called out the positions of the circling fighters. Then, the starboard engine's temperature needle began its unstoppable climb. They were on borrowed time. In that moment, Dawson faced the binary choice he had foreseen: die following the doctrine or die testing the theory. There was no middle ground. "I'm shutting it down," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Shutting what down?" the co-pilot barked. "The starboard engine, now." Before anyone could react, he did it. The second engine died. The silence was absolute. A vacuum filled instantly with terror and the scream of the wind. The nose dropped. They were in a 700-foot-per-minute glide. What happened next was a 5-minute masterclass in applied physics and psychological warfare. The first Zero dove from high astern, building speed for a classic killing pass. The pilot, seeing the bomber seemingly helpless, lined up his shot. At 500 yards, he fired. But his closure rate was too high. The bomber was not holding a steady course. It was sinking. His aiming point was wrong. His rounds passed underneath. He hauled back on the stick to avoid collision, zooming up in front of the bomber, his speed bleeding off as he climbed. For a critical second, he was a near-stationary target. Dawson's tail gunner, following orders to hold fire, now had his moment. A sustained burst from the twin 50s caught the Zero in the engine and cockpit. It flamed out and spun into the sea. Confusion rippled through the remaining Japanese pilots. A second Zero attacked from the beam, trying a deflection shot. The same phenomenon occurred. The bomber's slow, sinking flight path defied his lead calculations. He overshot, and in his frantic pull-up, he stalled his wing and entered a spin from which he never recovered. 2 Zeros were gone, without the bomber taking a single hit. The remaining fighters became cautious. They made tentative, high-speed passes, firing from longer range, but unwilling to commit to the slow-speed tracking fight the dying bomber now demanded. Dawson, his hands gentle on the controls, managed the glide like an engineer running a test. He even dropped a few degrees of flaps, steepening the descent further, tightening the energy trap.
The Zero's tactical cohesion broke. Unable to process this defiance of aerial combat norms, and having lost 2 of their own to a plane that was already dead, they broke off the attack. The last of them climbed away, disappearing into the haze. Lucky Lass, silent as a glider, continued her long fall toward the ocean. Using every ounce of lift from her wings, Dawson coaxed her toward the distant coast of New Guinea. With no power, no hydraulics, and almost no control pressure, he executed a dead-stick landing on a rough coral emergency strip. The aircraft shuddered to a halt, its props frozen. The crew stumbled out, not cheering, but shaking, staring at their aircraft and then at their captain in a silence of profound disbelief. The ground crew chief ran up, expecting to see catastrophic damage. "Where's the flak hit?" he asked. Dawson, wiping his glasses, replied with engineer's precision. "Check the port engine for a seized bearing. The starboard is fine. I shut it down." Part 5. The Contagion of an Idea. The official debriefing was a fractious affair. Intelligence officers were skeptical, then astonished, then intensely curious. Dawson's gunner footage and the corroborated accounts of 6 men were undeniable. 4 Zeros destroyed, 2 damaged, against a bomber that had taken 0 hits. Dawson submitted his formal report, appending pages of calculations. The 5th Air Force bureaucracy did not know what to do with it. They couldn't order a radical, dangerous new tactic based on 1 success, but they couldn't ignore it. A provisional tactical bulletin was quietly circulated. It did not mandate Dawson's Glide. It merely described the incident as a case study in unconventional energy state defense. It was stamped "for information only, not a directive."
This was how revolutionary ideas spread in combat, not by command, but by rumor, by trusted whispers between pilots sharing a cigarette after a mission. The story of Lucky Lass became legend. Did you hear about? Tale passed from squadron to squadron. And then it happened. Again. A B-24 crippled over WWII. Its pilot, having heard the story, made the same desperate choice. He killed his engines. The attacking Zeros overshot. The crew ditched and was rescued. Another incident followed, then another. The success rate wasn't perfect. The maneuver demanded icy nerves and precise airmanship, but it was replicable. The physics worked. By late 1943, a subtle but statistically significant shift appeared in the loss data. The survival rate for bombers suffering multiple engine failures crept upward. Officially, credit was given to better fighter escorts, the new P-38s and P-47s, and improved tactics. But in the annotated margins of after-action reports, a few perceptive analysts noted the curious frequency with which pilot-initiated controlled glide following total power loss resulted in successful evasion of enemy fighters. The maneuver had entered the ecosystem of survival. It was never official doctrine. It was a last-ditch secret shared between crews, a final card to play when the rulebook had nothing left to offer. It was the triumph of adaptive thinking over rigid dogma. Epilogue: The Silent Legacy. Eric Dawson completed his tour, was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with a citation that spoke vaguely of exceptional airmanship, and returned home. He went back to the University of Washington, earned his degree, and spent a long, quiet career as an aeronautical engineer at Boeing. He rarely spoke of the war. He viewed his desperate act not as heroism, but as problem-solving. The U.S. military, meanwhile, quietly absorbed the lesson. By the 1950s, revised fighter combat manuals contained sections on energy deficiency tactics and using attacker closure rates against them. The principle was sanitized, stripped of its origin story, presented as a product of tactical analysis rather than a pilot's terrifying gamble. Jet-age fighter pilots learned variations of the concept, how to trap a faster opponent by forcing them into a low-energy state. Dawson died in 1994. His obituary mentioned his service and his career. It did not mention the day he rewrote a page of aerial combat theory. His daughters later donated his wartime notebooks to a museum. They gather dust in an archive, filled with elegant equations that once saved lives. The true legacy of August 7, 1943, is not found in a manual or a footnote in history. It is found in the timeless principle it demonstrated, that in the face of an impossible system, survival sometimes demands not just courage, but the intellectual bravery to question the rules themselves. When the entire world, your training, your commander, the enemy circling above, is certain of your demise, the only way out may be to turn off the engines, embrace the fall, and think.